long as people have been studying politics intelligently, they've been understanding that one of the problems key in it, is that you give some people power and you don't want them to abuse it. How do you give it and limit it at the same time? This is a question of particular importance in the American Revolution, where they have, of course, thrown off the king, extremely powerful man, because he was bad and he was exceeding his authority. And yet they had fought this war, against this powerful king, and they needed to assemble a lot of power to do it. So they actually want a more powerful government, but they don't want it to abuse them. What I think the wisest of them thought was that every human use of power required to be restrained and directed toward the good, as opposed to self-interest or the bad. So one of the ways they went about that was to make the government purely representative. That means we get to pick the rulers, but we don't rule. So we said in the Declaration of Independence that the king was suspending the legislature and wouldn't let them elect another one, right? Elect another one. The representatives of the people are not meeting. You see, consent gives rise to representation. Now, why would that make for a control on the government?
Because the government doesn't receive its legitimacy without the consent of the governed?
Yeah, and it isn't even abstract, right? Government is a monopoly, It's, if it's true, as we said before, that politics is natural to the human being, that they always live under laws, that it arises from their gift of speech, which is the classical argument and also the founders' argument about government, then there's always going to be government, right? And you're going to be in the government, and it's going to have a monopoly on force. But on the other hand, it can't really do anything unless you say it can. And that's not the king's idea. The king's idea is, you're going to have kings. It's in the order of nature. I was born to this. I'm going to be the darn king. And you're going to be the people. And I'm supposed to take care of you, and you're supposed to do what I say. And that's not grounded in the consent of either one of us. We have this station, we're stuck with it. Once you change that and you say, the government can really only do what you say it can do, that limits it drastically. And how's the government established? What's the first step in the establishment of the American government?
Breaking away from the government we were under.
Happened in the, yeah, okay, that was good. Happened in the, we have a code. It happened in the what? In the Declaration. Yeah, we all got that one right. So, so we get the government, right? Now we've given consent. Is that enough? What else do we need? Constitution. Wait, because we have to keep giving it, right? You have to give consent to form the government. But then after that, do you need more? Do you need to be saying okay on an ongoing basis? Because if you do, you're going to need a constitution. What was Hitler's constitution like?
Kind of like believe what I say or die.
Yeah, he actually, I don't expect you kids to read my books, so I can quote them. Hitler came to power in 1933, and Hitler wouldn't take the job unless Hindenburg and the leaders of the main political parties would promise to support an enabling act, he called it, that would liberate the government to do whatever it wanted to do. Hindenburg was reluctant about this, and Hitler, a very clever man, offered him something. He says, I won't do anything that affects the powers of the presidency. In other words, the one person who I won't touch is you. And so Hindenburg said, okay, right? That itself is a kind of violation of consent, right? Because, and of the rule of law, because now they're not going to live under the same law anymore, right? So Hitler's constitution is Hitler's will. And that'll work if one person gets to make all the decisions. But if a lot of people are going to make the decision, you're going to have some form by which they can indicate authoritatively what they agree to. So if you're going to involve a lot of people in the government, you're going to have a constitution. You're going to have, and you see why the Constitution has to be different from the things that is actually in the law? Because it prescribes the process by which the ordinary laws would be made. It can't be the same as they, right? So, and that is, by the way, implied right through the middle of the Declaration of Independence when they talk about the king messing with the government all the time in the way that he was doing. You see? So, consent requires representation. And representation requires a written way for that to happen. Do you see why you'd have to have a representative form of government if you were going to have a big country? Why is that?
I mean, if you had a democracy, you'd have to have everyone there. There's too many people. It's just
That's right.
A mob rule.
Yeah. I don't know how many of you have been to Washington, D.C. I go often. We have the Kirby Center there. The people coming from California would be at a terrible disadvantage from the people who live in Northern Virginia, right? And so it can't be very big if it's not going to be representative. And since there has to be some mechanism for consent, and since they can't all meet personally, they're going to have to elect some people. Now that we know that consent requires not just agreement that there's going to be a country, but a mechanism so that people can govern, oversee the actions of the government over time. And now that we see that if you're going to have a big country, you're going to have representation, this opens up a whole world, these two things. The founders, it turns out, are really glad that this world that we're about to describe, happens, is open, because what do they think about democracy?
It fails.
And why?
Because the majority ultimately starts to rule. There's no protection of the minority interests.
Becomes tyrannical.
It can't control faction.
Define faction, Christian.
Any group interest that may or may not have the majority.
Emily.
It's also, on top of that, the interest that it has is in violation of somebody else's interest within that group.
Or of the
whole.
Yeah.
the public interest. Mm-hmm. In the very famous Federalist 10, how do they describe the public interest? There's an expression they use. It's really great.
I think they describe it as the permanent and aggregate interests of the community.
Well done. Well done. Yeah, the permanent and aggregate interest of the community, which would be a separate thing from the particular or temporary interest of any one of us or group. So it's not, by the way, just stopping the government from doing what it wants to the governed. And remember, in a representative system, there's going to be something you call the government, and they're going to be different from the people they represent. That's how we solve the problem that Lily brought up, the problem that the people in California don't have the same chance to get to the meeting as the people in Northern Virginia, right? You're going to appoint them to do it, right? And so one thing representation does is it stops them who are the government from doing stuff to the governed that the governed don't like. So if you have a constitution, you can spread the decisions out over time. By having representation, we've already said, you spread the decisions out over space, right? You can have a bigger country, and everybody can have a say in it, because they don't have to go there all the time. They can all have the same say in it. But also over time. In other words, reason alone of the people must be placed in control of the government. Their passions must be controlled by it. Writes James Madison. That means, by the way, do you see what I just said? The implication of what I just said? I think, on this point, that I know better than many citizens and the majority of the citizens in their worst moments. Aren't I wise, right? Constitution doesn't let me change it just because I think so. or just because I've studied it for a long time. Government is by nature very powerful. It has a monopoly on power. It has to be like that. Representative government requires a society separate from the government, big enough to control that great power.